Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 103 of SCOTONOMICS. Thanks so much for joining us from, as you can see, a very sunny Barcelona. I think our other two guests looks like it's pretty sunny where they are too. I hope it's nice where you are. This evening, we've got a really interesting conversation with Dave Watson from the Jimmy Reid Foundation. And please do give us any thoughts and questions throughout the interview, because I know Dave will be too happy to answer them for you. We'll have Dave on stage in a couple of minutes, but the first thing for me to do is to welcome my co-host, Karen Van Sweeten. Hello, Karen. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yes, I'm very well. Anything you want to mention? Anything take your fancy over the last week? Considering we're still in the midst of a general election campaign in the UK.
Well, yeah, it was nice to hear the IFS or a representative from the IFS on Radio Scotland on Sunday morning, talking about talking Scotland up actually as an economy. So that was quite nice to hear that. So you can find that somewhere. It's not actually on his feed or the IFS's feed, but the SNP are sharing it obviously, and it's in the National. And the other thing that I'd probably like to point out is one of our guests, Richard Murphy, is also interviewing people, and he interviewed Drew Hendry on the economy. So another one to look out for as well.
Great. Certainly a lot going on. And there's a football tournament, which we won't mention, of course. Well, now I'd like to welcome our guest for this evening, Dave Watson. Hello, Dave. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good evening, folks.
Hello.
So, for those who are not aware of the Jimmy Reid Foundation, it's a think tank which brings together different voices from across the left in Scotland to make the case for economic, environmental, political and social equality and justice in Scotland and further afield. In doing so, the foundation seeks to build on the legacy that Jimmy Reid left us. You've also got a sister organisation, which I believe was the organisation that birthed the Jimmy Reid Foundation, which is the Scottish Left Review. And that's a publication that's Scotland's oldest radical print publication. When did those editions come out, Dave?
They come out 5 times a year, so it's roughly every two months, and a bit of a hiatus over the summer. But that's the usual aim, and we have managed to achieve that virtually every year since Jimmy was part of setting it up. Yeah,
great. Yeah, it's never easy committing to do something on that diary and then managing to get out. We know all about that. It seems like there's a lot going on there, and we'll put the links to the Scottish Left Review in the comments below as well. Well, I suppose before we get into much more of the economic discussion that we want to have tonight, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and your kind of various roles? Because I think you do a few things within the Labour movement as well as working with the foundation. So over to you, Dave.
Yeah, sure. I'm a graduate of the University of Strathclyde. I'm a lawyer, not an economist. So I'm probably on the wrong podcast, but we'll work on. I suppose you described me as a career trade union official. I did have an early career in leisure management, but worked for NALGO and then Unison when it became the large public sector union it is today. And I finished in 2018. I retired as Unison Scotland's head of policy and public affairs, involving obviously legislation, lobbying and all the work of the trade union movement, plus negotiating teams. In particular, I suppose in economic terms, I was the joint secretary of the largest pension fund in Scotland, and so obviously there's quite a lot of economic thinking going behind that. I also had a couple of secondments to the Scottish Government in the early years of devolution to introduce a radical new HR strategy for Scotland, and later I was an expert advisor to the Christie Commission on the reform of public services in Scotland. Since 2018, I've been working as a policy consultant part-time, although my wife would probably argue that that's not the case, but mostly in Europe and in the UK, and some Scottish clients as well, working for a number of think tanks in Europe, doing comparative work with European policy analysis. And for the last 18 months or so, I've been the director of the Jimmy Reid Foundation. I was always on their project board for many years, and they asked me to take that on, which I was very pleased to do. So I'm a great admirer of Jimmy Reid's and the work of the foundation. And particularly I thought Scotland has a dearth of think tanks thinking generally. So I hoped I could offer something there in terms of developing the foundation.
Fantastic. Kieran and Dave, I could leave both of you on screen and talk about pensions, I think, for a bit then. Kieran's doing some work on that. We were just speaking about that just before you joined us, Dave. Maybe we'll cover pensions again in much more detail in another episode. But yeah, we're really keen to hear your thoughts, because, you know, you're putting out these policy papers and they're really important. And your perspective, I think, is really important for our audience to hear. So you're definitely on the right podcast, Dave. I assure you of that. When I was looking at the foundation, it says here, you know, I've written it down. The work of the Jimmy Reid Foundation is based on a series of underpinning principles drawn from Jimmy's radical political thinking. I'll just read a couple of them then. Society should be based on equal and social justice. People should have the democratic power to influence their workplace and social institutions. Quality of life should be the forefront of political debate and not an afterthought. And there's a couple more. But when I was reading it, I thought there's a real clear similarity to a lot of work that's happening in Scotland at the moment around the well-being economy. Do you think can you see that connection? And is there work to kind of connect those, as I see them, very similar perspectives, but maybe bringing them together a little bit closer? I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that.
Yes, obviously, the concept of the well-being economy rather postdated Jimmy's time. But if you read what he said in his writings, both his books and his extensive collection of newspaper articles and journals, etc., he was talking about the concepts that today we would describe as the well-being economy. So I think I have to emphasise, we're not a historical society. We're pursuing the values, but we put them in a modern context. Obviously, Jimmy sadly passed away some time ago now, about in 2010, and so the world moves on, and ideas and concepts move on. But I don't think the values move on. So we leave those values on the website for good reason. And every single paper that I commission or I write myself, I often go back and look and say, does this match in with our values? And we turn down offers of papers from people who want to write papers because we don't think they match those particular values. Just one example to give you, we did a big briefing on libraries, for example, and Jimmy famously, someone asked him which university he went to, and he famously said Govan Library, and he would be horrified by the cuts to the library services and those sort of reductions. So that was a very good example where I was able to put a particular example of the sort of things that Jimmy would have felt very strongly about into a modern context, when we've got not just cuts to the service, but we've got changes in the way information is collected, the internet, podcasts like this. All this has obviously changed the way we deal with information. So I think many of his values stand up today, but we're not trying to dig over his historical words. In another hat, I'm the secretary of the Keir Hardie Society, which is more historical. But again, we look at his values and try and apply in the work to today. So I think it's important that we don't get overly bogged down as in historical detail, but we focus on values.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. And when I was trying to draw those kind of connections, I often think that you could see the kind of modern birth of the well-being economy was kind of J.K. Galbraith's idea of the affluent society, and I think there's a clear kind of historical connection, and I can see within the values that they would fit very comfortably within that modern context of a well-being economy, but a slightly older version being this idea of the affluent society. Well, let's finish. Let's one more question around Jimmy Reid then. I would hope that all of our audience have heard of him. Please do let me know. But I had a really interesting conversation with someone that Kieran and I have eventually ended up working with, who was in Dundee. He's a gentleman in his late 30s, and he said to me just a couple of years ago he came across Jimmy Reid, and I thought, for the first thing was I felt really sorry that someone had been in the late 30s who was politically active and hadn't heard of Jimmy Reid. And he said to me, as soon as I saw the things that he was saying, it kind of sparked and everything kind of made sense. And I just thought it was a travesty that people who want to have much more of a positive influence in our society are unaware of someone so inspiring and such a powerful working class voice as Jimmy Reid. Have you any thoughts why someone in an industrial city in their late 30s wouldn't have heard of Jimmy Reid?
I suppose a number of people might blame the education system for our lack of people understand that. But given I'm married to a modern studies teacher, that's not something I could possibly comment on. I think, I think modern history, particularly modern industrial history, is probably not something that's as well taught as it ought to be. If we're fair there, I think most people will probably never have heard of the dispute that made Jimmy famous, which of course was the work in the Upper Clyde shipbuilders in 1971-72. I mean, that's where he became famous. But I suppose I would say yes, that was very important. It was a seminal dispute. It was the way it was handled and organised was brilliant in its day. But he's probably more famous internationally for the period when he was rector of the University of Glasgow. He made the famous rat race speech, and the New York Times actually described it as the greatest speech since Lincoln's address and the Gettysburg Address. That's pretty big heading to go for. But I often get asked, and we get probably every other week get a request to use clips from that particular speech or use the words. And every year we hold a memorial lecture in Glasgow, usually around October time, when we invite major speakers, politicians, trade unionists, civil society folk and we always reproduce the speech because obviously every single speaker obviously picks out the values from that brilliant speech and puts it in a modern context. So it goes back to what I was saying earlier. So I think that's what I think Jimmy's probably famous for. But could be more famous, and I know my own wife used the clips many times in teaching kids at secondary school, and I would hope others would do so as well. They're well worth watching, and even these days, tonight we're on YouTube. You go and have a look at something like Jimmy's interview with Kenneth Williams on the Parkinson Show, for example, to just see how brilliant he was. Kenneth Williams thought, this is an ignorant shipbuilder. What does he know about culture? And he actually wiped the floor with him, thanks to the Government Library again, because he took out books out of Government Library that virtually nobody else did, and taught himself. And there's much I think to be said about that as well.
Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah, I think it's a real shame. Kieran, any thoughts on why kind of a character like this wouldn't be better known within Scottish society in general?
I guess probably I would guess that young people have such a huge access to information nowadays. Jimmy Reid was a huge influence on my dad. My dad was a shop steward. He worked on the rigs. He started the first strike in the North Sea. So, and he was blacked for his efforts. So, Jimmy Reid was a huge influence on my family. And I knew all about him. But yeah, it's, there is just so much information out there. Maybe it's just that's why.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks so much for both of your views on that. Well, Dave, if we could just, we'll pull away for that now, but I would encourage anyone, and I'm sure our watchers and our listeners know who Jimmy Reid is, but please do take this opportunity to go and read those speeches again or see that interview on Parkinson. And if you haven't, please do find out more about the man. I'd like to get your views now, Dave. A kind of general overview I thought we would start with. I'd like to know your take on the kind of neoliberal period in the UK, and if we start kind of like late 70s, what impact did that have on our economy and our society? And secondly to that, why was the trade union movement so important and a kind of number one target for these neoliberal policymakers?
I mean, I think that they clearly were, if you look at the work of Reagan and then Thatcher, obviously, and their drive there. I mean, essentially, this was about big business wanting to drive profits up, and the way you do that is by reducing the share of wages in the economy. So, and the economic thinking behind that, and still very largely mainstream economic thinking to this day, is that if profits go up, then there'll be investment and GDP will rise and everything will be wonderful. But it didn't happen. What happened was profits went up, wages went down, GDP growth slowed. Quite the opposite to all the thinking of the supply side economic gurus. And what filled the gap and kept us going for a while was household debt. I mean, essentially, households built up debt, filled some of the gap, and that led, of course, to the financial crash and to ongoing problems to this day. I mean, when the OBR produces its report for the UK budget every year, the first chart I go and look at is household debt. It tells you all you need to know about the state of the UK economy. And I think the other thing it did at that time, and one of the reasons was that trade unions try to, don't always achieve it, take a long-term view of what they're doing. Risk of bunching pensions in there again. We take a long-term view there, and the problem with that neoliberal economics have driven the short term. They talk about the productivity puzzle. It's not a puzzle to me, I have to say. To pinch Bill Clinton's phrase or abuse it, it's investment stupid. And the simple fact is that private and public investment has reduced, and the consequence has been that productivity has gone down and wages are affected by that. So, company profits are not being reinvested. They're gone in dividends. They've gone in fat cat salaries, to put it bluntly. You look at the wages that are paid to people. I mean, quite apart from Elon Musk and his £56 billion pay rise. I mean, it's just staggering sums of money. And you only have to look at the privatised utilities to see that privatisation and private investment has not been put into the services that the public actually needs. Plus, I think that short-termism is missing a lot of the long-term things that trade unions care about, things like climate change and the well-being economy that we mentioned earlier. So I suppose my overview would be that I think neoliberal economics has failed to understand the demand in determining demand side of determining growth in the economy. To give a very recent example, if you open the business pages of most of our newspapers, there's an endless regurgitation of press releases from some business organisations. In fairness, not all. And it's just incoherent. I mean, there was one the other week that was complaining about the minimum wage going up, and also complaining that people didn't have money in their pockets to buy the services of their members. And clearly, whoever wrote this press release could not see that these two things are inextricably linked. And it just drives me around the bend. You follow our Twitter feed, you will see me trying to restrain myself in terms of the language from this sort of nonsense. The simple fact is, if you look particularly in Europe, with one or two exceptions, most European economies, and I see this in my European work, are wage-led economies. And therefore, it's wages that we need to focus on. And weaker unions, therefore, mean weaker growth because of the loss of collective bargaining and other interventions in the economy. So, companies on themselves will generally, not all in fairness, but will act in their own interests. So, essentially, they need government intervention. They need trade union intervention to have, obviously, in terms of regulation of wages, but also, more importantly, in many ways, is stronger collective bargaining. So, I suppose the analogy I sometimes use is fishing. That we have regulation to stop fishermen overfishing in the North Sea and elsewhere. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any fish. And that's why we need regulation and we need trade unions there. So, we've had inflation recently. Again, even the IMF, and you can't get much more neoliberal than the IMF. The IMF says that, in fact, inflation has been driven by company profits, not by wages. That's true in the private sector as well as the public sector, neither of which have had. But in the public sector, there's no impact on inflation. But in the private sector, even there, it's been supply shortages. So, again, it's the supply side, demand side. And I think that's our summary of where the country's gone wrong in economic policy, and why we need to get back more to an understanding of demand side economics.
Well, that's a really good overview of the reasons. But could we just kind of briefly chat about the effects And over that kind of neoliberal period, if we're talking the 1970s, can we talk about the differences between the late 70s, early 80s, and where we are now, and what you think this kind of neoliberal period that has stopped listening to the voices of trade unions and has prioritized or been able to prioritize profit ahead of wages? What impact do you think it's had on Scotland and the wider UK society over that period?
Well, I mean, Scotland in particular, but it's true right across the UK. We've seen it in the devastation of communities. I mean, I worked in the health department for 2 years, and you just saw by the data and the issues that the long-term impact that has to this very day. And you can go to communities that have never recovered from the devastation of the Thatcher years, and so I think it's a real thing. You see it in the health of Scotland. You see it in what some health economists call, the Glasgow effect, for example, in terms of deindustrialisation and the impact that's had on our health. So it's not just the economy that damaged; it's a much broader issue. And if you look at the work of people like the Equality Trust, essentially more economically equal societies do better on virtually every single measurement, and so that's been the big change. In the 70s, it wasn't all. People often say, "Oh, we're going back to the 70s," and I say, if only, would be my general response to that.
There's one stat that I'll give you, Dave, because we with all the interviews, we kind of quite often we touch on the 70s and 80s, and one of the stats that one of our guests gave us was that the worst year for unemployment in the 70s was the best year for unemployment in the 80s. So it's really all about the perspective, and I think the 1970s has been painted in a very particular way, and there's a belief that the 80s was so much better because we unleashed this kind of the inner entrepreneur in our society, and the economy just burst from this wonderful period of time. That's just not true, and we also need to look at the ecological impact of what happened in the late 70s and the 80s, and the commercialism and consumption to have these huge planetary damaging effects. But I think it's a good point. We're all on here bigging up the 1970s, but it does get a pretty bad rap. But I'll let you go back to your
Right. In fairness, it probably wasn't the greatest decade for fashion either. I was, obviously around then. I suspect I wouldn't go back to that. But for music, it wasn't so bad, I thought. Anyway, not that I have any decent taste in that either. But in terms of the economy, I think one of the, obviously trade unions were much larger. We had an industrial base, which was obviously the core of many of the industrial trade unions and the growing strength of the public sector trade unions at that time, and taking a more radical approach. One of Unison's predecessors, NUPE, for example, started to develop during that period. I'm currently reviewing a book on the Transport and General Workers Union in that period for the Scottish Labour History Society, and it's very interesting, reminding me of many of the things that many of the conflicts of that time, and the actions of people like Jack Jones and others in terms of working with the government of the time, and how that partly did work and partly didn't work, but there was a different approach to the economy. In other words, there was a genuine bringing in of the economic partners, so that government actually set up the structures to engage with government and engage with trade unions and employer organisations. And I do work in Europe, and particularly in the Nordic countries, and they have much greater trade union density, but they also have the infrastructure and the institutions which engage business and trade unions in a regular dialogue. And that's what died in 1979 onwards. All that went to bed. Now, in fairness, the Scottish government understands that, and I think the Scottish government's done a lot to try and develop that type of. I mean, the reason I was brought in, very unusually, bring a trade union official in to implement an HR strategy, and that was the first devolution government, and that was because they wanted a different approach of engagement, and the current Scottish government has taken that on board and continued with it. So we do have greater dialogue and engagement. People will fairly, I think, criticised that we could be quite good about developing strategies and talking about things and actually delivering them. That's a fair criticism, I think. We'll probably touch on the general election, but I do think one of the things I do like in what Keir Starmer's talking about is about the industrial strategy, about re-engaging with business and trade unions in those structures. And I do think that's vitally important. And the 70s does give us that template from which to work from.
Fantastic. Well, I'll give you another quote from one of our guests, which is Neil McEnroy, who said Scotland has more pilots than the RAF. So I think we're there with the pilots and the strategy there, Dave. Well, that's been a wonderful general overview. I think now we'd like to kind of look at some of the work that you've been doing recently. So the last paper that you produced was one on Scottish education. You were focusing on Scottish councils, and there was a long read in the Sunday Herald going into this in detail. So hopefully some of our listeners and viewers will have been able to see that again. We'll put the link in the comments if not. But could you give us a little bit of kind of the highlights? What was the key takeaway when you looked at the issues and the concerns around higher education in Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously we have a debate with the project board about what issues we want to pick up on, and we felt that colleges in Scotland and further education more generally has been ignored. And in fact, when I started the research for the paper, I was quite shocked. You know, as you do a desktop research project starts off, I was quite shocked. There was virtually nothing objectively written about colleges. Yes, a few college principals have written papers, promoting their own perspectives, but there was very little objective study of further education in Scotland. A couple of commissions recently, which have ground on, but not a great deal happened. So we felt it was important to take a new look at it, not least because obviously we've had years now of industrial disputes in the sector, which are an indication of very poor industrial relations, and also the issues of funding and funding cuts. The thing that I suppose the key takeaway that hit me which I probably hadn't appreciated, although obviously Unison had members in the sector, but I never personally dealt with it. I was shocked when I looked at the funding levels, that the funding for colleges per student is 2/3 of that in both schools and universities. Now, I don't get that. You walk around a college, you will know that a lot of their provision is quite expensive to deliver, very practical. You've got an awful lot of equipment and training and stuff to do. And I could see no reason why a secondary school, and it does lead you, I'm afraid, to the inevitable conclusion that, policymakers, and I don't just mean the current government, this goes back pre-2007 to probably pre-devolution. But policymakers, be they politicians, civil servants, and others, the kids go to secondary school, then they go to university. It's working class kids who go who go to colleges, and that's why I didn't pick the headline, but headline writers will take their own headline from that. But I think it is a class issue. I really do think that our colleges are underfunded because they don't have the voice that universities and other parts of the education system have. So the report, which you can read on our website, the Herald stuff is obviously behind a paywall, but no doubt they'll free it up sooner or later. But the full paper you can read there, and there is an executive summary because it's a long paper. But we make a series of recommendations there, which is yes, making a start on funding, getting back to what I think should be a more equitable funding solution. It does need to sort out industrial relations. There is a culture, I think, of poor industrial relations in the sector. Now, you can't impose that from outside. I know from my own experience, you have to build that culture, but that I think is doable. But I do think we also need to, the thing that struck me as somebody who was very closely involved in abolishing the internal market in the NHS in the early years of devolution, that colleges looked to me like the old market in the NHS that the Tories had before devolution. The trusts, for those of you old enough to remember them, where they were told to compete with each other. And this is where colleges go wrong. And they spend money on marketing. They even one lecturer told me that his college actually put an advert, bought a billboard outside another college to try and poach students. I mean, this is ludicrous in a country the size of Scotland. So, there's 11 recommendations there, but essentially it's a different approach to to colleges, which I think is crucial, not by the way just for students and staff and the colleges themselves, but for the economy. If we're going to get to a net zero economy, then colleges are absolutely crucial to that. How many times do you read in the newspapers business saying we can't get the staff to, to work on wind farms? It was only this week, I think, there was a piece on that. Well, that's because we're not investing in colleges, and we need to.
Fantastic. That was a really good summary.
Because I feel really strongly about.
Yeah. Well, I do want to dig into that. The first thing that I picked up from the report was, this is a key theme that we cover in Scotonomics, and it was great that you've picked it up, because you don't see many other commentators or looking at these issues and analysing it from an institutional approach. But you looked at this and you thought, it's not being funded properly. A classical economist would say, well, there's a price gap here, there's a market failure, and they would look at this kind of, the institutions of price, and they would maybe say they're too cheap or too expensive. But what you've done is something as heterodox economists we do, and we'd take a much broader picture. And you've identified this common theme, which is the establishment, and I'll go further than what you said, which just being policymakers. And I think you have to put this idea of the establishment in play, that the establishment don't send their kids to colleges. So they're not going to, they don't see the value of supporting that. And this is something that affects us right across society. It's one of the reasons or the main reason that we think that there's no library anymore, and it's closed. No one goes, you've got failing high streets, because the establishment don't shop on the high streets. They never went to the library. They're not funding further education. So it was really good to see that point highlighted. And it's something we often say to our audience is kind of look for these deeper reasons past what you would see a kind of classical economist. And I think that's really important. And I've been looking at that from the perspective of education, public education in general. It's no surprise that Westminster doesn't value public education in England, because so many of their kids go to private education, and I think there's less of that in Scotland. So I'd be interested to see a comparison. But I think the general theme there is something I really agree with. The next point I wanted to cover was the funding gap. Could you give us a little bit more about the kind of amounts and the kind of key question? I think is that obviously everyone who writes a policy paper looking at issues in Scotland and the Scottish government, the first thing they say is that we need some more money. So can you talk about the kind of amounts, and then we'll have a discussion around where this funding comes from for further education in Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking the difference in funding per student is about £2,000 a head. I mean, it's that large. So you're talking about £7,000, £7,500 for a university student, about £7,500 for a secondary school student, and just over £5,000 for a college student. So that's the sort of gap you're talking about. So yeah, inevitably you are to plug that gap. And nobody, even in my wildest dreams, thinks that's going to happen overnight. And you need to build these things up anyway. But you are talking about hundreds of millions of pounds in the longer term to plug that gap. So, and yeah, of course, I fully accept that, because we produce papers right across the board about public services and about the economy. But all of these things do require money, but they also require other forms of reform as well. So I think it would be very easy, and I accept criticism that we just throw money at something. No, you don't. You have to make that reform. If you just gave all the colleges several £100 million tomorrow, would it solve many of the core problems? Well, it would solve some of them.
We'd have a lot more billboards by the sounds of it.
Well, there is that risk. I'm sadly old enough to remember the NHS trusts when I opened the Glasgow papers on a Friday for the jobs to see them advertising marketing managers, and when I knew there weren't enough nurses on the wards. So these are sort of things that and obviously the spending by colleges has rightly been criticised on chasing silly targets like international students and the expenses and poor governance, frankly, of colleges and college boards. But in fairness, one college chair of a board said to me, who would serve on a college board when every single agenda is about cutting the college? I mean, why would you put yourself through that? Why would you volunteer to serve on a college board when that's the situation? So I think funding is important, and obviously there's a broader issue there about how we fund public services in Scotland, and colleges has got to be part of that debate.
I just wanted to say, going back to your earlier thing that you spoke about with the journalists and what they were saying about the minimum wage and about people not having money to spend, and that lack of systems thinking and not thinking about a currency as a system that a government uses in order to force goods and services to be exchanged between each other and as a method of saving value, etc. And the government's not really thinking about how that's going to work, So, and then take that back to the colleges. I noted in the Herald article that Paul Little, the principal of City of Glasgow College, earns close to £170,000 per year, with an annual remuneration of over 200,000. He has charged more than 100,000 in expenses over the last 10 years, including more than 13,000 at a private members club in London. So what's the regulation there as far as remuneration for the staff and the percentages? Because obviously I know that that's happening in the university sector. And again, it's coming back to that system. Well, if you have a lot of currency going to one person and not to where it needs to be, then that's not going to go well for society.
Yeah, I mean, bluntly, it boils down to governance, and as I was saying that boards struggle to attract people to serve on them. Even the government I know struggles to recruit the best people to chair the boards. Now, if you don't have good governance, then what happens is that things start to drift, expenses, management salaries, etc. And we've seen this not just in colleges, but very recently for another area that I do know very well, which is the water industry in Scotland. We've seen that with the Water Industry Commissioner and sending people off to Harvard when we've got universities in the UK that could have delivered exactly the same training. My old university would have been only too happy in their business school to do that. And then the expenses culture and then everything that goes with that. And these were signed off effectively by the sponsoring department in the Scottish government. And you have to ask yourself, what on earth did a civil servant looking at that think it was right to spend whatever it was, £57,000 on a trip to America to Harvard University? So there is a governance issue on issues like that, but I think it is indicative of the general problem that we have, that if we don't have good governance, the right people asking the right question, you get weak governance in the in the private sector as well. I mean, I've worked in the private sector with private companies, and I know you can get issues there as well. But at the end of the day, people, if you serve on a board, you've got to be asking the right questions, and you've got to be prepared to make yourself unpopular on occasions. And sadly, well, yeah, and if you look at our Quango state, something I wrote about separately a couple of months ago. We have, God knows, it was 144 Quangos, and too many of the same people sitting on the same board, turning up, opening the same papers, not asking the right questions. So I do think governance is a key thing for Scotland, and I also think it's indicative also of a very centralised state that we have in Scotland. And I think that devolution below the level of Holyrood, we can argue about powers to the Scottish Parliament. What about devolving some of those powers down to genuine local authorities and strengthening our governance, getting people engaged in governance, whereas at the moment we have huge local authorities, the most centralised in Europe, and working people haven't got the time or the resources to serve as councillors on those bodies. We had smaller councillors with more on the European model. You start to find people, for people very skilled in their day jobs who would be prepared to give up an evening or so during the week, but they can't give up 2 days a week to be the sort of full-time councillors we have now. So there's a lot to be unpicked, I think, about governance in Scotland, but colleges, I'm afraid, are an example of very poor governance in the main. Not everywhere, in fairness. I did talk to a couple of colleges where I thought, they've done a really good job, but I have to say, overall, not so.
I should bring some comfort to you in the sense that I'm studying very hard right now for the Pensions Committee. There's a lot of studying for it with the pensions regulator and with a company called Hymans Robertson, who set up the teaching for councillors so that they can scrutinise the officers and the people running the pension fund. So that that is definitely seems to be working quite well, and certainly from my experience on that.
Good. I think that's so important. I mean, actually, pensions are the one thing I do think can be centralised in Scotland. I think our individual pension funds and we will get better local investment. But I can remember attending conferences arguing this, and councillors telling me that but we invest locally, and I had to point out to them that they weren't investing virtually a penny locally, and they had no idea, absolutely no idea, simply because it's very complicated. They needed the training, they needed to know the right questions to ask. So I think a lot of that goes into the governance cup.
Great. Dave, you've picked up again another couple of themes I just want to highlight before we move on there. But again, you looking at those institutions and understanding actually how they function, and that it's not just about the economics of a pension fund. It's much more about the overall integration and the dynamics and how it works. I think is really important. And I think speaking about who it is normally, who has the time to be a councillor, who has the time to serve on these boards, it tends again to be the type of people that they would kind of loosely class within this establishment. And if there's not people who are fully engaged with the issues or concerns of working class individuals, then their rights are not put forward in the spheres. And that's what we mean when we talk about the establishment. I think it's really important to say we're not saying there's some kind of like collection of people who are all colluding. It's just the circumstances that bring together people who start working on the things that they value. And it tends to be people who are already wealthy or who are in a very different position from a lot of people in society. I want to just summarize and give you some of the comments we've had so far. We've got one new fan. Chris, do read the speech that Dave spoke about at Glasgow. Was it Glasgow or Strathclyde?
No, it's Glasgow, University of Glasgow. Yeah,
Glasgow. It's a fantastic speech. We've got a comment. Maybe we'll get to the Labour manifesto and a little bit around the general election. We've got a comment there. A question or a comment from Chris again. From within a secondary school, non-teaching, I've observed a depressing lack of value in vocational college courses, despite a lot of discussion over this. What's your views? I'm going to give you one view, which is again an institutionalist economics view, and that is to say that you look at the choices that society's making, and you break down every decision, and what part of it is a ceremonial decision. How much is it prestigious for us, and how good is it for us to say to people, we've got X amount of so many people doing these courses, and that's the kind of ceremonial point. And then you've got the actually useful part of it. And what seems to happen is that we're focusing a lot on these things as a society, where we're able to be really proud or supposedly proud of the things that we are supporting. So we've got 10,000 people doing English literature or the classics. So we're pushed towards, the society is pushed towards valuing these things for their ceremonial value rather than the practical value. And we need to focus much more on the things that make a difference and make a positive impact, rather than focusing on these things that supposedly make us look more like everyone else within the international arena. So that's my kind of perspective on that. Dave, do you want to give us that? What are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a comment I've heard many times, and my wife's retired now. I think I can quote her as saying that that was her experience as well. And a lot of people say that, and we would talk to students who were told, oh, you want to go to university, or you want to do this, or stay on at school, when actually a vocational course in a college was a much better option. It's also a different style. There's about I actually my family moved to London when I was a teenager. I went to a sixth form college, which was something you don't see very often elsewhere. And so I did my A levels in the sixth form college, and it was a more relaxed environment in many ways. But basically, the staff said, "Look, Dave, if you don't work, you'll fail. But don't expect me to chase you every 5 minutes because you're not at school anymore." And some people, I flourished in that environment. And I think a lot of kids do as well. So I think it is about getting it right. And part of it is that snob value that colleges are not as good as universities. And again, I know it's a bit of a trope, but it's true. You go somewhere like Germany, they really value vocational education, and they just don't understand it. When I do workshops with for European think tanks, and you talk to people from other countries, they just don't understand. Why would you not put money into this? Why would you downgrade the value of your further education sectors? Because these are the people that are going to get you to net zero. These are the people that are going to drive your industry. So I do think there is, and a bit of this is about competition as well, because head teachers will put pressure on teachers to say, well, success is measured by how many kids you get into university. It's not measured by how many kids you get into a education course. So
that's Dave. That's that ceremonial value that's perceived as having that kind of ceremonial value compared to the practical or the instrumental, as Thorsten Bevlin kind of separated that. And I think that's really important. And I see that when you see governments saying things like, we want to have 10 unicorn startups by the end of X, and these are just purely ceremonial things so that these people can go to the next dinner they're at with another foreign investment minister and say, oh, we've got 5 unicorns. These things are just crazy. We really need to start focusing on the things that truly deliver value. Thanks for those. There's another couple of comments, but I think that's just a little bit too specific for what I hope we're going to cover now, which is to go back to funding. So, Dave, let's talk about funding options then. So you're in the situation, you're making these recommendations to the Scottish Government. What's your thoughts? Where does this money come from to kind of cover this funding gap within our higher education?
Right. I mean, essentially, we need a different approach to public spending and raising money, and I think more generally that requires us. The biggest gap in our obviously we're in favour of unsurprisingly in favour of progressive taxation, certainly on income. But I think the biggest gap, as we and the STUC and others have highlighted, is the failure to tackle wealth. And I don't get, I know Labour's not saying very much about capital gains tax and the inequity about how income raised through capital gains is taxed compared with income tax, but they're obvious areas to address, as is wealth more generally. So I think those big tax issues need to be addressed along with tax dodging. The simple fact is successive governments, and I noticed both Labour and the Conservatives are asking tax dodging to do quite a bit of heavy lifting in this election. But I think taking the necessary actions are ones that the government have not been prepared to do, not least to invest in the staff at HMRC. I mean, the chasing of tax dodging is a handful of workers at HMRC compared with those who are chasing down pennies in welfare benefit alleged fraud. So I think if we did some of those things, then we could improve the revenue available to do other things. Now, some of that's in the UK.
Just to kind of separate that then, because this is important. And as you said at the start, if this is an economic level that you don't feel that comfortable with, that's no problem at all. But it was kind of covered in the report. So if we're speaking about revenue for the Scottish Government, some of the things you've said are issues or the things that would have to be sorted at the UK government level. So, for example, a more progressive taxation in Scotland if it's carried out by the Scottish government, then a huge chunk of that, and the last publication that Spice put out, the information service at the Scottish Parliament, said that for the first 3 years of the Scottish Parliament, almost 80% of the revenue that was gained from the changes in the tax bands was knocked off the block grant. So I think the figures were round about 800 million, and we got about 170, something like that, actually. So when we tax at that when we tax income tax in Scotland, that money or any taxes that the Scottish government brings in, a large percentage of it has or will or could go effectively and be reduced off the block grant. So we're taxing, but we're not raising the same amount of revenue that we're taxing, which is very kind of economically unproductive. What's your thoughts on that? Because that's the situation that the Scottish government is in. It's really difficult for them to tax when they're not getting that revenue.
Well, it is, although, you'd have to say it's a bit of their own problem of their own making. They negotiated the fiscal framework, and many of us, pointed out at the time, this is exactly what's going to happen under the structure that they agreed and reviewed recently, in fact, on that basis. So we published a paper before the fiscal framework, the original one, was agreed, and we got, in fact, Jim and Margaret Cuthbert Jim particularly did some very detailed work on the framework and pointed out the difficulty is that, there's little more complicated than public spending formulas, whether it's in the health service or local government or in the fiscal framework. And I suspect, frankly, there's probably very few civil servants who understood the detail of that. I remember talking to a Treasury official at the time, a friend of mine, off the record, and he said to me, I said to him, what do you think the Treasury's big issues are? And I said, it'll be the fiscal framework. He said, nah, he said, nobody understands that, and that is the problem. Our problem is borrowing powers. He says we don't want to give the Scottish government, we want control in the Treasury over borrowing powers. Now, I well remember both John Swinney and his Labour predecessors getting a lot of grief from the Treasury over prudential borrowing powers at local government level. Yeah. So one of those things, it makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever that a local authority has a prudential borrowing power, but the Scottish government doesn't.
It is a crazy situation. So that's again back to the funding, so it is to say there is a funding gap, but at the Scottish government level, you've identified the weakness in the fiscal framework, and also Scotland can't borrow at all for day-to-day. It can only borrow for infrastructure or capital spending.
And even that's limited, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. 450 million a year, I think. So these are tiny amounts. So it's really difficult, we would say, for the Scottish government to find get those monies to resource that. And ostensibly what they have to do is take funding from somewhere else to be able to fund that. And whether or not we can say that this is more important than a whole variety of other things, I think it's a different conversation. But I think it's important for Kieran and I that we get that across, that I'm interested in your point when you're talking about the funding gap. Are you really saying this should be directed towards the currency issuing state, which is the UK government, and the UK government should be giving Scotland a much bigger grant so that we can fund these things? Because as you know, the UK government creates money. It can never run out of money. It doesn't have to find money like the Scottish government does. So are you planning to lobby the UK government in the same way you have been lobbying the Scottish government?
Absolutely. The briefings, we did one on this very point around taxation. We also published a detailed pamphlet on constitutional issues like this, one written by Jim Mitchell at Edinburgh University, and I and other people have written on the constitutional points and the financing of this. So yes, I'm personally a bit sceptical about the benefits to us of full fiscal autonomy. I think there are dangers in that. I think particularly in terms of the way wealth is concentrated in the UK, I am worried that Scotland would lose out quite badly in that. But nonetheless,
In what way? So in what way would it lose out?
I think because too much wealth is concentrated in London, and if we were just taxing wealth in Scotland and not taxing on a UK basis, I don't think we would do as well as if the UK government took the appropriate actions to tax wealth at a UK level.
Yeah.
Plus, I think
there's an assumption there that taxes pay for public services. Is that what you're saying?
No, I mean, we all know that that's not the case entirely. There are other ways of the government raises money, and obviously, the UK has powers the Scottish government doesn't have, and that's where issues in terms of fiscal policy and in terms of its ability to raise money and borrowing and so on are all matters.
Any money. That's the important point we need to discuss. The government doesn't raise any money. The government spends money into existence. It only accounts for spending from taxation or borrowing. But Scotland, as an independent state with its own currency, would be able to fund anything it wanted to buy within Scotland. It doesn't use taxes. It doesn't use borrowing to fund spending.
Yeah, I think that may be the case. I would say there are other considerations there in terms of what impact that would have on our own currency if we got to that situation. And I think we're not the only people to struggle with that issue. The S&P's had 2 commissions on it, and the struggle to come to an answer as well. So I think whether we had our own currency or not, and whether that would give us the freedom that the current UK government, which is not using, but has used, but it's used often for the wrong purpose. But those powers, I think, are very important. I think if we're independent, and B, if we had our own currency, these are a long way off in the future. And I think my focus now, frankly, would be to get the UK government to understand the importance of raising revenue through proper, progressive and wealth-bearing taxation, and using its broader powers for good to invest in the economy and take a broader view of that, both in the private and the public sector.
Well, we would agree with that, but we would just say it's not raising revenue. That's where I think we would differ. We've got to tax wealth. We've got to tax wealth for a whole variety of reasons, and reducing inequality being the main one. And it's so important that we, for our audience, highlight that these huge structural changes can only be done by the government that runs the country and issues the currency. And in Scotland, we're in a position where we've got wonderful progressive people like you calling for the Scottish government to do stuff, but it can't, because it doesn't have the capacity to do that. Now, whether or not it would when we're independent is another discussion, but the Scottish government cannot just spend £5 billion to improve all the education within Scotland, because it has to earn that money, whereas the UK government can create that money and decides not to do that. It doesn't use the power that it has. Because I think if it did, then the report that you did on education, I think, had some wonderful points. I'm really sorry, but we've come to the end, and we haven't got to cover the general election. So maybe, Dave, why don't we arrange to have you back on after the summer, once there's a Labour administration in Westminster, and we can maybe talk about what you see the difference will be having a Labour administration. We don't know what's going to happen in terms of seats in Scotland, but it'd be really good to hear your views on that. It's been fascinating going into a lot of detail there. We've had some really great comments from our audience as well. But if you're up for that, Dave, we'd love to have you back after the summer.
I'll have to do that, no problem at all.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for the comments and the questions. I was scrolling through, and again, we'll definitely get Dave on, and we can maybe answer these in a little bit more detail. But I hope that was a good overview of the work of the Jimmy Reid Foundation, and an insight into Dave's thoughts as well. Thanks so much for joining us, Dave. Bye for now.
Cheers.
That flew by, that hour. So thanks very much for the comments. We will get them on, because there's loads of stuff to talk about again. I think it was really important for us, because we haven't had that many trade union voices on. I've asked several people within the SDUC to come on and do the show, so we're really keen to have these views. Of course, we had Grace Blakely a few weeks ago talking about some of these issues from a UK perspective. But if anyone knows any other trade union members who want to come on and talk about their views on the Scottish economy, then please do get in touch. But that's all for now. It's 9 o'clock here in Barcelona, and we'll see you next week. We've actually got another conversation with a working class perspective on the climate, so please join us for that. Until then, thanks for everyone, and see you later. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.